The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the suburban neighborhood where Malcolm Hayes found solace after a long tour with Delta Force. He strolled leisurely with his loyal German shepherd, Rex, savoring the moments of peace that had become a distant memory. The faint rustling of leaves accompanied the rhythmic tap of Rex's paws against the concrete, and every breath brought with it the fresh scent of cut grass. Malcolm cherished these ordinary snippets of life. After all, it was in these moments of calm that true strength was found. But, as he walked deeper into the neighborhood, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if a shadow loomed just out of sight. Cars slowed as they passed, and curious glances turned into sidelong stares. He had seen this subtle form of intolerance before and learned to navigate it. Just a week back from his assignment overseas, Malcolm had hoped for a reprieve from the uncertainty, an escape from the dangers that had haunted him in distant lands. But in the heart of his own neighborhood, the stranger's eyes felt heavier, more constricting than any hostile territory he had ever encountered. But today was supposed to be different. Today's walk was supposed to be about relaxation, a temporary retreat from the chaos of the outside world. That is, until an all-too-familiar sound shattered the tranquility, the slow drone of a police cruiser creeping nearby. Malcolm's instincts kicked in, honed from years of training and survival. He felt Rex tense beside him, the dog's keen senses alert to the unfamiliar energy radiating from the vehicle. When the cruiser rolled to a stop beside them, Malcolm's pulse quickened. "Afternoon, sir," came the uninspired voice of Officer Gregory Calloway, a familiar figure, but one that brought nothing but flashbacks of tension and intimidation. Behind him stood Officer Anthony Miller, his partner, wearing the smug guise of someone who believed they held power just by virtue of their badge. "Just checking in on you," Calloway declared, a statement designed to dangle authority in front of Malcolm's face like a gaudy trophy. "You live around here?" "Yes, sir." Malcolm's voice was steady and calm, a practiced politeness that masked the simmering tension beneath his surface. "I travel a lot for work, but I just got back." Miller scoffed, eyeing Rex like he was a beast rather than trained protection. "A merc," he sneered, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "That's nice. Walking your war dog while you're at it." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he remained unfazed. He knew they were here with a purpose, that their interest had nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with intimidation. "Just enjoying a quiet walk," he replied, schooling his tone to keep it polite. "But if you have questions about my dog, Rex is trained for obedience. He's disciplined." "Yeah, trained to intimidate," Miller chuckled, stepping a little closer to Rex, whose low growl hinted at the rising tension. "Stay cool, boy," Malcolm commanded softly, looking down at his companion, feeling the muscles beneath the dog's fur tense with anticipation. Calloway leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "We got a call about suspicious activity, and you're not exactly the same face we're used to seeing around here. You mind showing us some ID?" Malcolm inhaled deeply, every instinct screaming for calm. He had dealt with threats before, but these men were different. They operated in the gray, knowing they had the law on their side, and that made them dangerous. "Of course," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, every movement deliberate, careful to avoid giving them an excuse. But in the back of his mind, he felt it, the prickling perception of danger dancing along his spine. "Perhaps just a few more questions," Calloway smirked, leaning back like a predator eager to pounce. Malcolm's heart raced, but he silently reminded himself, stay calm, react with control. It was all a game to them. They wanted a reaction, wanted to see him squirm under their watchful gaze. Then, without warning, Miller surged. "You're a threat," he threw out, his words laced with aggression. Malcolm felt the world tilt as everything accelerated. "Stay down," Calloway shouted, drawing his weapon with practiced ease. Before he could process the sequence, Rex lunged forward, the low rumble of a warning growl escaping his throat. "Control your dog." They both barked, hands reaching toward their guns, the atmosphere pulsing with unrestrained hostility. Malcolm moved, instincts taking over as he gripped Rex's leash, calmness shoved into the back, while resentment washed over him like a tidal wave. "He's fine. He's trained," he yelled, trying to diffuse the impending chaos. The situation spiraled too quickly. He could see it, the moment when an invisible line was crossed. All it took was Rex's defensiveness, and suddenly, the mess of testosterone-fueled fear and bravado spilt into the open. Then it happened. The shot. The violent crack of gunfire swallowed him whole, drowning out everything but the sound of Rex collapsing at his side. Malcolm's heart plummeted, his instincts flaring into overdrive as chaos erupted into his once peaceful world. "No, Rex." His voice broke, a raw mixture of rage and disbelief cascading from him as if the heavens themselves paused. In that moment, the game changed forever, and Malcolm transformed from a victim to something far more dangerous, an avenger, relentless in his quest for retribution. He stared down the officers, who still held their weapons ready, unaware that by drawing first blood, they had set him free. The fight had just begun. The fight had just begun. Malcolm's world had shifted in an instant, from a tranquil afternoon to chaos bathed in violence, every heartbeat drumming a relentless rhythm of loss. Panic swirled around him, heightened adrenaline blurring the lines of right and wrong. The once steady ground beneath his feet felt like shifting sands, threatening to pull him under. "No, Rex." His voice echoed, reverberating off the houses that were supposed to be home. He sank to his knees, cradling the lifeless body of his dog against him, fingers digging into the fur now matted with blood. The world around him faded. Nothing mattered except for the weight of Rex's body, the warmth of loyalty slipping away. Something primal surged within Malcolm, igniting a spark of fury hotter than he had ever felt in battle. It wasn't just anger. It was a terrifying awakening, a hunger for justice that demanded to be fed. He felt the stirring, the whispers of vengeance pulling at his core, igniting shadows in his mind that had lain dormant for too long. The officers were still shouting, their voices a distant echo amid the rush of blood roaring in his ears. Calloway and Miller exchanged glances, myriad expressions cascading over their faces, indifference, confusion, a smidge of fear. They had crossed an invisible line, one that shattered their illusion of invulnerability. Malcolm wanted them to feel it, to recognize the weight of their arrogance before the ground beneath them fell away. As horror twisted into resolve, Malcolm became a soldier once more, his instincts kicking in with precise clarity. He pushed away from the ground, standing tall, rage fueling him. "You think you can just walk away? You think this is a game?" The words erupted from his throat like a storm unleashed, raw and feral. In response, Calloway, trembling slightly, raised his gun again, but Malcolm shot him a steely gaze. "You dare?" Before he could react further, a disorienting burst of energy surged through him, fueled by righteous indignation. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever suffered at the hands of those sworn to protect them. Rather than cowering in panic, he charged forward, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Rex's death had pulled the mask off his grief, revealing the raw, unrefined power of a man who had nothing left to lose. His movement was fluid, instinctual, a dance attuned to shadows and muscle memory. He spun, deflecting Calloway's grip, slamming his elbow into the officer's stomach. Calloway staggered back, gasping, and Malcolm capitalized, delivering a swift kick to his knee that sent the arrogant officer crumbling to the ground. Miller, panicked, stepped forward with his weapon drawn, but Malcolm saw the hesitation flicker in his eyes. The fear that had always lurked beneath the surface was rising. "Put it down, now." Malcolm growled, voice low and dangerous. He advanced slowly, every step deliberate, watching the way Miller's grip tightened around his gun. "Get back." Miller shouted, desperation lacing his voice, but Malcolm could see past the bravado. He was a cornered animal, instinct screaming to protect himself. "Why? So you can shoot another innocent being." Malcolm spat back, his heart racing with both grief and anger, channeling the energy within him, turning it into a weapon sharper than any blade. "You think you have control, but you're the one who's frightened." With those words, he launched himself forward again, fists flying with precision. He sent the other officers stumbling back, dodging Miller's attempts to regain control of the situation, the instinctive defensive maneuvers turning to wild strikes, desperate yet uncoordinated. Malcolm surged forward, his focus unwavering as he closed in on Miller. Just one determined blow, that's all he needed. And then there it was, the tense moment where everything hung in the air like a tenuous thread ready to snap. He ducked just in time as a reckless swing from Miller flew by, narrowly missing him. Seizing the momentum, Malcolm spun, delivering a swift kick that sent Miller crashing to the pavement. Breathing heavily, Malcolm stood over him, adrenaline fueling his resolve as he glared down at the man who had wielded a badge like a weapon, indifferent to the life he had taken. Miller groaned, blood trickling from his mouth, his eyes wide with disbelief and hints of recognition. He understood now, perhaps for the first time, how powerless one could feel when the tables turned. "Your reign ends here," Malcolm growled, his voice low and menacing, not a trace of hesitation remaining in his soul. "You took what mattered most to me, and now you'll pay for it." But even as the realization washed over him, Malcolm heard the familiar sound of sirens wailing in the distance. Time was running short. He knew he couldn't stay. Those sounds heralded the arrival of backup, and he didn't want to leave Rex's memory marred by another round of violence. He had to make his escape, to turn his pain into something stronger, something far more potent than mere retaliation. In a split second, he retracted his focus, releasing the desperation that had consumed him, stepping back just as the sirens grew louder. He had seen this chaos unfold before in his life, the cycle repeating itself among those who stood against systemic evil. The world outside was still, but inside him, the storm churned. "You will rot for this, Miller," he hissed, letting that bitterness remind him of his ultimate goal. Whoever it took, whatever it cost him, he would find justice for Rex and all the other lives broken by officers who had taken their shields and turned them into weapons. Malcolm took one last look at the two men sprawled on the pavement, the reality of their actions finally dawning on them. Then he turned, running toward the far side of the street, blending into the shadows, his heart pounding in sync with the sirens closing in. This was just the beginning. He had plans, careful, calculated steps that would ensure vengeance. As he vanished into the night, he was already plotting. This fight wasn't just for him or for Rex, but for everyone who had ever suffered at the hands of authority wielded without empathy. And every step he took away from that moment was a step closer to dismantling the very system that had failed him. The game was on. As Malcolm slipped away into the shadows, the raw adrenaline from his confrontation with Calloway and Miller morphed into something more calculated, more focused. He wasn't just a soldier. He was an architect of vengeance, ready to dismantle the facade of power those two had so arrogantly maintained. Each step he took was less about fleeing and more about plotting, a move in a chess game, a play to turn the board upside down. He could hear the distant wail of sirens in pursuit, but it barely registered as panic. Instead, it became a symphony underscoring his resolve, a reminder that time was short. The longer he waited to take decisive action, the more likely they would be to rally and retaliate. They had already attempted to intimidate him. It was only a matter of time before they sought to bury him under the weight of their lies. Malcolm ducked into an alley, moving with practiced stealth. The shadows were his allies, and he let them wrap around him like a familiar cloak. He needed a plan, not merely to stay safe, but to launch his counteroffensive with surgical precision. As he paused to catch his breath behind a dumpster, his thoughts raced. First, he needed evidence. Video footage of the confrontation with Calloway and Miller would serve as damning proof of their misconduct. He recalled the security cameras positioned around his house, their lenses capturing every moment of police aggression. That footage could tear down their narrative, shift the focus to their heinous actions instead of his, and potentially lead to a full internal investigation. His mind began to map out the steps he would take. He needed allies, people who understood the stakes, the system, and how to maneuver through it. He thought of Jasmine, his sister, the tenacious attorney who had never shied away from a fight in the courtroom. Her knowledge of the legal labyrinth would be invaluable. She had contacts, information, and the fire in her that burned as fiercely as his. Malcolm resumed walking, faster this time, moving toward the apartment he shared with Jasmine. He slipped past a few curious onlookers, heads turning as whispers sprang up around the growing chaos, the police sirens, the news crews arriving, and the unfolding drama surrounding Calloway and Miller. He wanted to bask in the stories forming around him, but this wasn't the time. He had a mission. When he reached the small brownstone they shared, Malcolm peeked through the window. The apartment was dim, a single lamp casting a warm glow against the walls, but Jasmine was nowhere to be seen. He barely hesitated before knocking on the door. He had keys, but something felt more substantial about being invited in, just in case. Finally, the door swung open, revealing Jasmine's concerned face. "Malcolm, what happened?" Her eyes searched his, darting down to his hands, still stained with Rex's blood. The reminder struck hard, but he held her gaze. "I need your help," he said urgently, stepping inside and shutting the door behind him. "I had a run-in with Calloway and Miller." She turned pale, her hands gripping the edge of the door as her brow furrowed. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but—" his voice faltered. "Rex isn't." The weight of the words settled heavily between them, packing more sorrow than any plea could convey. Her expression shifted from worry to fury, breath hitching in her throat. "What did they do?" "They killed him," Malcolm whispered, trying to swallow the grief that threatened to crack his voice. "And I want justice, Jas. Not just for Rex, but for everyone they've hurt. They need to be held accountable." Her eyes softened as she stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "We'll make them pay. You know I'll fight for you, for Rex." "I need the footage from the cameras at the house," he explained, his urgency building. "If we can show what they did, maybe we can finally expose them for who they really are. It doesn't need to stop here. Maybe this will spark something bigger." Jasmine's gaze hardened, the fire igniting within her. "I'll contact Internal Affairs, get them involved. But we need solid evidence to back up anything we say. Just let me get the footage first. I have it stored, but I need access to the house to salvage it," he said, moving toward the hall. "I can go in now while they are still out looking for me. They'll be preoccupied with their own fallout." "Malcolm, wait," Jasmine began, but he was already set on his path, fueled by an adrenaline-fueled determination to confront the ghosts haunting him at home. He moved to grab his jacket and keys, keenly aware of the timing and the need for stealth. "I'll be back before they even realize I'm gone," he reassured her, slipping into the night with purposeful strides. The drive back home felt excruciatingly slow, each second dragging as he envisioned the worst-case scenarios playing out. What if Calloway or Miller were waiting for him? What if they had already crossed paths with the police? The streets began to feel like a maze, each corner turning into a calculated risk. When Malcolm finally turned onto his street, he felt the sharp pang of anxiety. The cruiser was still parked outside his house, lights dim but omnipresent, a reminder of their power lurking just beyond the threshold. He parked at the far end of the driveway, taking a moment to compose himself. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and glanced around, assessing the situation. The coast seemed clear for now, and he recalled the entrance into the house had 3 cameras recording, his safe haven turned battleground. The plan emerged clearly in his mind. He would disable the cameras and replace the footage to create a seamless transition, his exit no different than any other day. He crept toward the front door, his heart pounding louder than the sirens that still echoed in the distance. But at this moment, he could either succumb to fear or embrace the mantle of war that had settled on his shoulders. He reached for the doorknob, cold and steady beneath his fingers. Inside, the stillness hung heavily. Malcolm slipped through the threshold, closing the door quietly behind him. In that moment, his world became narrowed down to the hum of the appliances and the faint rustle of the wind outside. He had a mission, and every second counted. Scaling the stairs 2 at a time, he barely dared to breathe, driven not just by the memory of Rex, but the storm brewing in his heart. As he reached the room where the recording equipment was stored, he hesitated, adrenaline mixing with nerves and adrenaline coursing through his veins like wildfire. This wasn't just about retrieving evidence. It was about being the architect of his own destiny, reclaiming what had been taken from him. When he entered the room, he spotted the monitors blinking, indicators of life and capture blinking back at him. He quickly assessed the buttons, weaving through the footage. There it was. He felt his pulse leap. But suddenly, the familiar sound of a car door slamming jolted him from his focus. Malcolm looked toward the window, and his heart sank. He watched in horror as a cruiser pulled into the driveway, lights flashing ominously. They hadn't left at all, and he was trapped, cornered like a prey with nowhere to run. He quickly glanced around the room, mind racing. He needed a way out, and fast. He couldn't be caught here. He had fought too hard, lost everything too recently to be ruined now. Malcolm turned toward the back of the house, where the side entrance led to the alley. It would give him a narrow escape. Just as he made eye contact with the door, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the house. The officers were back, and on his heels. Apparently, McCall was doing everything in his power to make sure the nightmare didn't end this time. As adrenaline coursed through him, he seized his options, not to escape but to outsmart those who thought they had him trapped. With sheer determination, he darted back into the shadows, ready to execute his next move. Malcolm could already picture Calloway and Miller, stranded in their pit of despair, and he refused to let their cowardly tactics dictate the ending of this chapter. Whatever it took, he would not only get the evidence he sought but would redirect the fury and loss into a fight that would reverberate far beyond the walls of those who considered themselves above the law. The stakes were high, and this time, he wouldn't let uncertainty dictate his fate. He'd become the storm instead. And storms, after all, were meant to shake the earth and make waves. He would rip their world apart, piece by piece if necessary. And storms, after all, were meant to shake the earth and make waves. Malcolm pressed himself against the wall, heart racing and mind racing faster. He could hear the soft thud of footsteps approaching, their authoritative swagger echoing through the silence of his home. Time felt suspended, and he was caught between the urgency of his mission and the impending threat looming just outside the door. He couldn't afford to panic. He had to think clearly, strategize, and remain one step ahead. As the footsteps grew closer, he scanned his surroundings, looking for any opportunity. The window, the furniture, anything that could provide a means of escape. His eyes landed on a heavy desk chair positioned against the wall near a window. It would have to do. With calculated urgency, he moved toward it, adrenaline pushing him forward. In an instant, Malcolm shifted the chair underneath the window and climbed up, careful to make minimal noise. The world outside was dark, illuminated by the flickering lights of the police cruiser. He looked down. There was a narrow ledge outside that he might be able to traverse to the adjacent building, a long-abandoned corner store that had seen better days. He didn't have time to think. He had to act. With a deep breath, he pushed the window open, the hinges creaking ominously. He squinted into the night, gauging the distance. With a quick prayer under his breath, he climbed out onto the ledge, feeling the cool breeze wrap around him like an embrace, urging him onward. Just as he steadied himself, a voice crackled through the air, sending icy tendrils of fear down his spine. "You think you can hide, Malcolm? We know you're in there." It was Miller, his voice dripping with the bravado of a cornered animal, now sensing victory within reach. He wanted nothing more than to roll back, to challenge their audacity, but instead, he focused on his escape route. He eased himself along the ledge, careful not to glance down. The drop below was daunting, but his resolve remained unshakable. He needed to reach the store and vanish into the night. With every step, the tension in his muscles coiled tighter, the sound of his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He could hear Miller shouting orders to Calloway. No doubt they were regrouping, their reckless confidence fueling their urgency as they tried to corner him. He pushed forward, determination igniting his every move. When he finally reached the end of the ledge, he spotted a window on the side of the crumbling building. He took a deep breath and launched himself toward it, grasping the edge just as the ground fell away beneath him. He landed unsteadily but caught himself, quickly slipping inside the abandoned store before anyone could spot him. Inside, the scent of mildew and decay hung heavily in the air, mingling with the remnants of a forgotten past. Malcolm took a moment to catch his breath, eyes adjusting to the dim lighting filtering through broken windows. He needed to regroup, assess his next steps. He moved quietly through the aisles, memories of a once thriving community space filling his mind. The shelves were now empty, the floor littered with debris, echoes of laughter and life ghosting through the silence. He could almost see the people who once wandered these aisles, carefree and innocent, oblivious to the darkness that could be lurking around any corner. But he couldn't dwell on that now. He needed to get to safety and access the footage. He spotted a back door and edged toward it, peering out into the alley that had once been lively with the chatter of neighbors and vendors. The night was still, But he could hear the muffled voices of Miller and Calloway in the distance, their bravado punctuated by the sounds of radio communications and frantic movements. They were closing in fast. Malcolm darted through the back door before they could catch wind of his presence in the store. He had to get to his car to retrieve the external hard drive that held the footage. He sprinted down the alley, breathless and focused, weaving through shadows, praying the darkness would envelop him long enough for him to reach the safety of the street. As he emerged into a narrow side street, he finally spotted his car parked several yards away, the headlights still dimly glowing. Moving with urgency, he sprinted toward it, heart pounding like a wild drum in his chest. He knew the risk stacked against him, but the potential for justice fueled him more than fear ever could. Just as he reached the car, his foot met the pavement, a sudden creaking sound sliced through the night air. Malcolm turned in horror to see two figures emerging from the haze. Calloway and Miller sprinted toward him, guns drawn. "Get down!" Calloway shouted, urgency carrying an air of authority he couldn't escape. But Malcolm didn't go down. He surged forward instead, adrenaline pushing him to act. He threw the car door open, dove inside, and quickly fumbled for the keys as he felt the rush of air behind him. He could hear Miller shouting commands, a gasp of surprise escaping his lips as he recognized Malcolm's defiance. "Stop right there." But Malcolm had already inserted the key, his hands trembling against the wheel as he turned it, engine roaring to life just as the figure of Calloway neared. The car's engine sounded like thunder, mocking him as a man who would not bow down easily. In one swift motion, he slammed the accelerator, the tires squealing as the vehicle surged forward, narrowly missing Calloway's outstretched arm. The pulse thrummed vigorously in his ears as he shot out onto the main road, leaving behind a cluster of chaos knitted from the threads of brutality and courage. The wind rushed through the open window, a mix of freedom and terror washing over him. Malcolm forced himself to regroup, eyes scanning the rearview mirror for any signs of pursuit. They wouldn't stop, but neither would he. He couldn't allow their darkness to engulf him again. Not now, not after sacrificing so much. He headed toward an old friend, a photographer named Theo who understood the value of indisputable truth. Their planned rendezvous held the potential to shift the tide. The streets flew by beneath him as he navigated through the city, the weight of his mission heavy on his chest. Each passing minute pulled him closer to Theo and the fortitude necessary to expose the corruption that plagued their lives. But as he turned onto a familiar street, he felt the familiar sinking sensation return, an instinctive awareness that he was being followed. In the rising shadows of the city, headlights were closing in once again. Malcolm tightened his grip on the wheel, adrenaline sparking anew as he steered onto a side street, veering sharply in an effort to throw off whoever was on his tail. He could feel the urgency pulsing through his veins, the roar of his heart a stark reminder of the lives at stake and the truth that lay just ahead. He needed to stay ahead of them, needed to reach Theo and ensure the footage was safe, a beacon of hope in the looming darkness. Every ounce of his will ignited his determination as he drove deeper into the heart of a city rife with shadows, their secrets beckoning for light. Every intersection became a choice, a step further toward justice or deeper into a labyrinth of despair. As he made one final turn, he spotted Theo's workshop at the end of the street, a secluded space lined with bold artwork and photographs, evidence of stories so often untold. Relief washed over him as he pulled into the adjacent alley, adrenaline still pumping through his veins. But as he exited the car and dashed toward the entrance, a familiar chill coursed through him. The clamor of silence surrounded him. It thrummed with the weight of uncertainty, the same doubts that had trailed him from the moment everything began. Malcolm reached the entrance only to find the door ajar, hanging loosely on its hinges that had been forced open. His heart sank, the primal fear clawing at the edges of his mind as he stepped inside, the dim interior suddenly feeling much more ominous. "Theo," he called, the single word laced with urgency. The silence was deafening. He stepped further inside, every instinct on high alert. The walls were covered in photographs that had once captured joyful moments. Now they stood as haunting reminders of what had been lost. He searched each corner, breathing heavily, dread rising like smoke in his chest. And then came the flicker of movement, a flash of panic skittering across the floor. Malcolm turned sharply to his right and found Theo, battered and tied to a chair, panic etched deep into his features. "Malcolm!" Theo gasped, the urgency in his voice pulling Malcolm back into focus. But just as he lunged for his friend, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. The quiet whispers wrapped around him like chains, tightening with every second they persisted. He whirled back, finding Calloway and Miller standing at the entrance, their eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger, the glint of malice dancing in the air. "Thought you could escape us, did you?" Calloway sneered, stepping closer, authority dripping from his voice like poison. Malcolm clenched his fists, lightweight in comparison to the danger they posed. "You'll never win this fight," he shouted back, determination flaring in his eyes even as panic tickled the back of his mind. "Is that so?" Miller crooned, stepping inside, gun raised. "You really think you have the upper hand? You're all alone now, just you, me, and your friend. This town isn't big enough for all of us." In that moment, the walls shrank around him, and a wave of fear crashed, challenging the fortitude he had mustered. But he wouldn't let that disillusionment win. He could feel the weight of hope pressing against despair, giving him just enough strength to take a step forward. "Your power is built on fear and lies. This ends here, with or without you." The words came from deep within, steady and unyielding, a challenge thrown back against the tide of darkness. And while Malcolm felt small standing against the crooked law, energy began to swirl around him, igniting a fire to match the storm of rage brewing in the air. He took a deep breath, drawing upon the resilience that had pushed him through the night. Whatever it took, he would not back down. He wouldn't let that darkness snuff out the light. This was more than a fight for Rex. It was a fight for everyone silenced by the weight of authority, for every soul that had been cast aside, marginalized, dismissed. With a fierce conviction, Malcolm surged forward, ready to become the tempest that would ignite the storm, challenging the odds, and standing strong. No matter the outcome, he knew that he was ready to face whatever came next, come what may, armed not just with his fury, but with the truth. And this time, he would make sure it shook the foundations of their world forever.